Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the DC Bar Pro Bono Center's webinar, Reopening the Office, Considerations for Bringing Back Workers Safely, brought to you in partnership with Mintz Levin. I'm Daryl Maxwell, an Assistant Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. Before we get started with the webinar, I'd like to thank Lauren Paley, our program specialist and webinar expert, for helping make all this happen, particularly with this webinar's implementation. Next, a huge thank you to our friends at Mintz Levin, Tyrone Thomas and Danielle Bereznay, who will be leading today's discussion and are really excited to be working with us, and we are excited to have you guys as well. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few logistical items for today's webinar. First, this webinar is being recorded. Additionally, you have access to a copy of this webinar in the Handouts tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. If you'd like to share this with a friend, there will be a copy of this webinar on our resource site, www.lawhelp.org/DC/CED. For questions, please use the question box in the dashboard on your computer. During the presentation, I will share those questions with our presenters. Businesses continue to grapple with unprecedented challenges during this pandemic. As the District of Columbia and surrounding jurisdictions look to lift their stay-at-home orders, employers are planning to welcome employees back to the workplace with a little bit of trepidation. Business operations will likely look vastly different during and after the pandemic. Tyrone and Danielle will help us understand what some of the proper practices should look like. For their expertise, Danielle and Tyrone, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Daryl, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyrone Thomas, and on behalf of myself and my colleague, Danielle Bereznay, I really want to thank each of you for giving us time to discuss this important topic of reopening the office. We, like many of you, I'm sure, have been following many of the developments that have gone on in the last several months related to COVID-19 and the concerns that would accompany bringing folks back. Some of you may have folks who are partially back. Some of you may have people on reduced and changed schedules, and we're going to touch on a lot of those things going forward. Just by way of introduction, Danielle and myself and our firm, the Mintz Law Firm, has been in existence for 87 years, and we've been pleased to advise particularly nonprofits and people affiliated with nonprofit world and also small businesses for the last 4 decades here in the DC area. With respect to my particular practice, I advise small businesses and large businesses as well as executives. So there's a wide range of concerns I know that I have heard, and for Danielle's benefit, as I go to the second slide, she has had the benefit of working not just on the side of employers, but also with the plaintiff's bar. So we have the benefit of having both sides of the perspectives of both sides of the coin here. So as we have a little bit of an issue going to the next page here, Daryl, but as we start this, just to give you an idea of what our playbook will be, thank you. Our goal, just to give you a scorecard, what we're going to be talking about, is to talk about best practices operationally related to handling the pandemic and structurally what you may need. Taking a step back and talking about some of the recent developments here in DC as they related to return to work, and really give you this framework for how we're seeing things nationally and how this may play out further in DC specifically. We're going to give you the benefit of the state of the layland, but in the lay kind of not in lawyer speak, but talking about what the legalese has been on this, but putting it in language you can understand, so you can understand what employers are required to do at the federal level and here at the local level. To the extent that some of you, by the way, also have operations that go across the moat to Virginia or extend to Maryland, we will have anecdotes here and there that may affect that as well for your benefit. We're going to talk about some of the non-legal issues that are equally important, such as communication strategies and safety plans and things of that nature. And then we'll wrap it up kind of looking ahead and going forward. But I always thought with presentations like this, it's always have a good idea to know exactly what you're going to be seeing as these things go forward. So if we go to slide 3 here, which is going to be talking about what we consider the transition aspect. And I want to emphasize that you're not alone. If you're like myself, you may be working off-site, like a lot of our employees are, and you may have to have a whole different regimen of contacting, because I know there's a number of different employee work sizes on this particular webinar. You may have a whole different regimen of how you contact your employees that you probably had if I talked to all of you in November and December of last year. So one of the common things I want to ask all of us to consider is fluidity. Guidance in this area has changed week to week, not just month to month. In some instances, we've seen it change day to day, and we'll highlight a couple of those. But it's important to be fluid and understand that you're going to have an ability to adapt, and it may be something physical, and it may be something you're communicating, just because as we get additional information about how this particular virus is spread and the likelihood of things that can help prevent the spread, there will be additional safety measures to be put in place. So the idea is to do this in such a way that we can reduce what is understandably a great amount of trepidation that employees are going to have going back to the workforce. And some of you may even have this when, like, employees, as far as talking about things like telework and do I have to come back, or if I only have access to public transportation. And we're going to talk about a few of those things going forward. So planning, right? Talking about the old saying about planning, right? Planning is everything. So what we'd like to introduce, and I want to make sure that we're talking about this in a way that is adaptable for your workplace, loosely a COVID-19 task force. And what I mean by that is a task force can be a person or could be a group of people. But the idea is that we have a person or a specific group, and it doesn't have to be a group of 30. Actually, I would actually advise against something that's overly large, that we know has had knowledge and getting the latest guidance, and we're giving them the information about reopening the workplace. We're giving them the latest advice and guidance about safety measures and cleaning and things like that. And then as regulatory measures are developed, that person is kind of on top of that. So there's a number of different skill sets, because if you think about this, there's kind of like an operational aspect to it. There's a health and safety aspect to it. There's certainly a regulatory compliance aspect to it. So in our view, it's important that this COVID-19 officer, so to speak, has some weight of authority. And we're not saying that you have to hire externally, but if you're going to redevelop someone's role to adapt to this COVID-19 officer, so to speak, it has to be somebody with weight that it's important that management or your managers or your supervisors are going to adapt to what they're saying and listen to them, that they should have the weight of authority that they can speak within your business. So make sure they're a senior level and make sure that they understand, and there may be some training involved in this, they understand how you do business, right? It's important that if you have a business that there's 24-hour operations, right? How are things going to be conveyed in different ways? If you have a business that has a significant amount of public interaction, how are those things going to be? So whereas there may be some things that are concerns for some of you, we have to switch that depending on the nature of your business. So as I said before, we're going to have to bring forward a lot of disciplines within this, and the designated, just to go over some guidelines, we've gotten a number of guidances from different government entities. Some of this may be driving some of you crazy. I know this. I know for us as lawyers, keeping in touch with this is top line, and we're going to synthesize some of this for you so that we kind of part like, am I going to go to the CDC website? Am I going to look at every thing that DC Gov puts out? Am I going to go to ESA? Well, part of this is going to be fluid and kind of combining with this. But one standard that we're going to give to you is you're going to always make sure that we guide ourselves by the standard that's across the board. So, for example, if CDC says that something should not be done, but the EEOC has not yet given an opinion on it, our opinion is going to be, let's make sure we adapt to CDC guidance, because as far as a risk factor, it's implicit that the employer probably or should have known that there was some risk involved based off what CDC guidance says, even though it doesn't have the same applicability legally as some of the EEOC things. So we're going to make sure that we talk about these things on a regular basis, and that if we have this task force or meetings with this individual, that we should have these at least in some segmented period, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, but some fairly regular period, meeting with that person and discussing how the transmittal of communications will go out to our supervisor or frontline people. So with that, we're going to go to key recommendations related to specific the DC phase 1 that is now commenced, and I will give this to Danielle.
Thank you, Tyrone. So as many of you, or most of you know, we're in the phase 1 of DC's reopening, something that we've all anxiously been awaiting. As Tyrone mentioned in his opening remarks, there's of course going to be changes in the way that we operate, as everyone can expect. So just as an opening, the DC government website breaks down the city's guidance in great detail, shows what resources, of course, the CDC and others that the city relied on in creating its reopening guidance. But I wanted to highlight some important points and recommendations that are taken from there that will be important moving forward. So as you can see from the slide, some of these are industry specific, but I think a lot of these are good considerations no matter what industry you're in. One of the main takeaways here is that you will need to have policies in place. And that's something that Tyrone will touch on a little bit more in detail, but DC reopening guidance across the board recommends having set policies. One thing to note here is that you'll want to have policies in place that not only include how your employees act and interact with customers, visitors, vendors, but also how those folks conduct themselves with regard to health and safety in your business. So here are some of the things that you can do. Having policies that relate to occupancy, spacing, PPE requirements, sanitation, and displaying these policies for customers and visitors. When you look at the different guidance, no matter what industry you're looking at, you're going to see that these policies need to be displayed in some form or fashion for people entering your business, picking something up from your business, whatever industry you're in. So for example, you might want to have something visible that says customers may not enter the premises if they have a fever, if they have COVID-19 symptoms, and that they must wear a mask or a face covering. And that's something that those businesses, essential businesses that were open during the stay-at-home orders have been doing, and I've seen that around the city. But this is something that's still recommended and required in most industries to have during this phase 1 opening. Some other things and considerations in terms of spacing, for example, the DC guidance recommends for barbershops and hair salons having 5 people per 1,000 square feet. This will obviously look different depending on the layout and format of your business. I don't think you need to be a barbershop or a hair salon to have thoughts and conversations about how you're going to have people in your business and what you're going to do in terms of spacing and social distancing, which we'll also touch on a little bit later in the presentation. As many of you probably know, restaurants can open in the phase 1, during phase 1 by having patrons dine outdoors with 6 feet of physical distance. Another consideration other than what to do when people are sitting down and eating is what will you do when people are waiting? They've got an appointment, they show up at your front door. What will you do with them to ensure that you're meeting health and safety guidelines? So you'll need to think about putting floor markings or having people waiting outside apart from each other, whatever works, again, for the layout and the space that you have. But this is absolutely something that should be thought about so that you don't run into a situation where you have clusters of people at your door that are not, from the same household or, not from the same group altogether clustered. Something else that's recommended, and again, this is something that can be used across industries, not just restaurants, is separating the entrance and exits to allow one-way flow of customers. And I think that this is something that, again, essential businesses that were open had been doing. I've seen that. So in those folks who are opening during phase 1, this is something that if your spacing and spacing allows, to consider doing. Of course, frequently sanitizing restrooms. will be important. Again, that's recommended across the board, across industries in the DC guidance. And then wiping down stations, tables, and chairs in between each use. So that means if there are diners eating, they get up and leave, somebody will need to sanitize the tables and chairs and everything. You know, if there's a candle or, you know, a flower pot on your table, sanitizing, wiping down everything there. And then, of course, the use of masks and gloves by employees. Move to the next slide here. Something else to consider if you're a restaurant is requesting that customers provide their names, their contact information, time of visit to utilize the contact tracing. You can also use the online reservation system. Now, I will caution that the collection of information should be sufficient enough to reach back to a person who would have potentially been exposed at a certain period, but you don't want to go and ask for social security numbers or home residence or anything like that. This should kind of be limited to an email or a cell phone, just to ensure that you can get in contact with that person. This was part of the DC Phase 1 restaurant guidance, but it might be something to consider in other types of businesses, depending on what type of industry you're in as well. Again, for restaurants, the use of paper disposable menus or one-time use products to save the time and effort of sanitizing everything. If you do decide to use the plastic coverings over menus, just note that you will have to sanitize every time you give that menu to a customer. Another recommendation that I think is great, and again, this was found in the restaurant guidance, but I think can be used across the board in different businesses, is a safety pledge that highlights your business's participation in the health and safety guidelines. So I've linked there the sample safety pledge, and it's detailed and it just shows dedication and your participation to ensure that everyone is being healthy and safe in your business. Again, if you are essential retail, if you are an essential business and open during the stay-at-home order, the DC government recommends that you continue following existing mitigation protocols. So some of what I've said is something that you may have already been doing. In that case, keep doing that, and you will be meeting the requirements of the DC Phase 1 guidance. And finally, something that I think is helpful and is a good consideration, again, for businesses across the board, is offering customers multiple ways to pay. So a lot of folks are switching over to digital platforms, which will avoid any of that close contact that we have, you know, the fun stuff when you're checking out, touching the credit cards, the cash, the pens. Even with gloves on, you know, it's still a little bit of a risk factor. You know, having someone, for example, pay online before they come and pick up food, or pay online, you know, even as they're dining. I'm not aware of all the different digital platforms that are out there, but I'm sure that there are many that you could look into and find something that works best for your business. So once you have all of this set, you're starting to think about, you know, reopening your business, the policies, and you're starting to get your plan going. You'll have to communicate this to your employees. Your employees will absolutely want to be in the know of what's going on. You know, as Tyrone mentioned in his opening remarks, this is a tough time. People are concerned about coming back to work. They're concerned about their professional and personal lives, including how they're going to stay healthy and safe in the workplace, job stability, commuting, leave their families. So start issue spotting into your employees' potential concerns, and then also prepare for how to communicate with your employees and build on any of the communications that you have to date. It's critical that you do this. It will make your employees feel a lot better, and they'll feel a lot more comfortable with what's going on, and you'll be supportive of their concerns. You should strive to keep open channels of communication. And there's different ways to do that, and this is very dependent on what type of workforce you have. So maybe you're a team that can easily do conference calls. That works best for you. If it's possible to do town halls in person, that may work. Maybe email blasts or intranet posts, virtual Zoom or FaceTime meetings, and then of course having the on-site workplace posters, which we'll touch on in more detail. Like I mentioned, you'll want to consider what type of employees you have. So if you have employees working in shifts, where if you do an in-person town hall and the day shift or the night shift folks are not able to be there for the town hall, be mindful of how and when you communicate these things, because you'll want to avoid a situation where, for example, the day shift folks are aware of the policies and protocols and are very much in the know, and then the night shift folks feel left in the dark because you couldn't blast an email fast enough and word of mouth kind of did the work for you, and they feel a little bit left out. So try to keep in mind how and when your employees work so that everyone feels that they get the information kind of at the same time and it's consistent, and it comes from, maybe someone on the COVID-19 task force, whether that's an email from everyone or one individual person that you've designated as that task force. Other less traditional means for communication are something to consider. So if you're an employer that has an active Facebook group maybe, or an employer Instagram account where people check in on it and use it, you could post communications and safety tips there. So be mindful of any privacy issues or putting anything confidential on those forums, but there's a lot of infographics out there on CDC websites that could be helpful, just as a refresher and reminder of how employees are expected to sanitize and interact with each other and that type of thing. And that could be something that's very much appreciated by the employees as well. Like I mentioned, it's important to keep in mind the nature and schedule of your staff. And, overall, just be open to exploring different communication platforms. It might be new to you that you're doing Zoom meetings rather than in-person meetings. It might be new to you that you're, doing a combination of these different types of communications, whereas typically you have one HR person that only does it in a certain way. Just keep in mind that employees will appreciate this attempt to communicate with them and provide this information in advance for them so that they have time to prepare. Finally, I'll wrap up with, it's important to ensure that communication is two-way. So your employees will want to know that they have a way to raise concerns or complaints to you as the employer. If employees are teleworking, you'll want to make sure that the reporting procedures for them are the same as the reporting procedures for the people who are coming into the workplace. You'll want to make sure that it's consistent. There's one way to raise it, whether it's having, again, the COVID-19 task force take that on, or saying that you need to let your supervisor know if you have a concern or complaint. Just make sure that there's a consistent way for employees to reach someone in management to voice their concerns. One thing you may see is that employees are concerned about maybe a lack of PPE on a particular day. You ran out of hand sanitizer, and that concerned people, and they want to raise that to someone. Or employees might say, my coworker isn't following the health and safety standards, and that scares me. Employees will want to know that they can bring that concern or complaint to someone. Again, there will be a lot of new policies and procedures, so maybe an employee training, whether virtually in person, will be helpful to get everyone on the same page and maybe avoid some of the concerns that could come up. Employee engagement will be important here as well. So daily life and work have really changed for everyone, no matter what industry you're in. Across the board, people are teleworking, people are, at home, caregiving, doing all sorts of different things. And maintaining work productivity, but also making sure that employees are engaged and they're centered and they're doing okay will also be important. So some ideas to pursue this in your workplace would be check on the types of benefits that you offer to employees and keep employees updated or informed of those things. If you have any type of employee assistance program, or you're aware of any type of mental health resources in the community that are available to employees, you can, send out an email reminder for people that those things are available to them. You could also do things like team building exercises or events to promote employee wellness. If the employees are split between a physical space and working from home, it can be easy for people to feel disconnected from the team. So one of the things you could do, and I've seen this done, is do a Zoom trivia, for example, to get everyone on Zoom, do a fun trivia game, maybe about your company or about DC fun facts, something like that, just to get everyone meeting and bring everyone together. And again, this is something that you want to consider circulating to employees before you are back in the workplace. And now I will turn it back to Tyrone.
Thank you, Danielle. And actually, just to really reemphasize that last point, given the obvious climate that a lot of employers are dealing with social action issues with their employees, between that and the pandemic, employee assistance programs are actually never been more important to look at as potential resources. So I definitely would encourage you to do that. And speaking of resources, I do want to, to the extent that some of you are listening to this information and wondering, and obviously you're going to get copies of the slides or have access to the slides. As an additional resource, and Danielle will present this, we actually maintain a firm blog related to COVID-19. So to the extent there's detailed information you would like that, as far as developments nationally on that, you'll have access to that as well. So now, preparing the workforce. And let's think practically about this, is that in a pandemic, of course, where you have people who have been affected from a health perspective, but also have loved ones who have been affected, there's going to be increased amounts of leave. For those of you who, like myself, have school-age children, the concern about how you would manage managing those the little ones going on virtual classes and things like that, and how that may manage with childcare and all those issues is going to be front and top of mind. So I would ask that, and just to do yourself a favor to get ahead of this, let's anticipate leave requests increasing. And with that vein, the leave laws have changed a bit for those of you who are of different sizes, and we'll go over how the different legislation, both at the federal level and in DC, has done that. But I do want to emphasize that with respect to DC, it's anticipated because the school is being closed for some time, that has a significant effect because that triggers certain standards related to benefits under leave policies, and it may, depending on what your policy may say, have further even long-term impact or longer-term impact as to who gets paid and who does not. But just consider that your ability to process leave, to the extent that employees are asking about leave, and how you're asking for information related to that, is something to be top of mind. So this goes back to things that will fall under the brand of not just your health and safety people. If you have, for those of you who actually have facilities where you may even have a medical professional on premises, but certainly under your COVID-19 specialists that we mentioned earlier on. Going to our next slide, which goes to the legislative aspect of this that came about really at the end of at the commencement of the COVID-19 crisis, which is the FFCRA, which getting up here in a minute. But under this new legislation, which was signed on February 18th, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and became effective April 1st. This extended the federal FMLA standards. So if you think about federal FMLA, that's for employers that had employees that were working for 12 months and they did the requisite 1,250 hours of service before requesting leave, that type of thing. And if you have the 50 employees within that certain 75-mile radius, you had a covered employee as far as having 12 weeks of covered leave under FMLA. So this goes beyond that. This goes to protections for FMLA leave for certain COVID-19 related illnesses, and actually gives, and hopefully for some of you, you've been able to take advantage of this where it's applicable, tax credits to help employers defray the cost of paying these benefits, or as those tax credits are processed. So under this law, one of the things that probably was striking for employers that you think about federal legislation is, things that apply for a certain amount of employees and above. Do I have 50 or more employees for this? Do I have 25 or more employees for that? Well, this is actually kind of the inverse in that it actually goes to employees below a certain number. And the reason for that is the federal government was concerned, at least Congress in this instance, expressed concern for mid-size and smaller size employers and the employees of those employers. So that's why this was done that way, to give those employers who may not have otherwise been included 12 weeks of job protected leave for this. Under this act, which again, somebody may or may not be familiar with, the first 10 days of leave are unpaid. Now, when I say that, if you have a leave policy that would provide, again, that's the floor. If you have a leave policy that would pay for that, that's fine. I'm not saying that you don't have to still abide by that, but there's not a requirement for you to do so. Now, that said, if the employee has accrued leave otherwise and wants to use it for that purpose, they can use their paid leave during those first 10 days so they can get paid. But after that period is exhausted, then there's actually a formula as to how the employees get paid, and we'll go to that on our next slide, because the basis of payment is triggered in part based upon the circumstances that relate to the leave itself. So if we're looking at the caps, we talked about the 500 employee or less, and again, these are additive benefits. So as I said before, if your policy provides something in addition to this, again, this is a floor, is not capping anything. So there's 6 bases here, and half give one level of paid benefits and the other half items 4 to 6, and I'll do this so in a way so you don't have to hopefully strain your eyes in reading it. But if you have an employee who is using the leave because they're under an isolation order, right? So you have a quarantine or isolation order and they cannot work or telework. So that distinction is important. If an employee is able to telework and your duties, the way you have the description, you're allowed to do that, that's not under that particular bucket. This is for someone who cannot work or telework. If the employee, again, has been quarantined by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. So there's some reason that for some health diagnosis that employee has gotten, and this goes to 2 and 3 really, that they themselves either been told to quarantine or they're experiencing symptoms related to COVID-19 and they're in the process of getting a medical diagnosis. If you're under one of these buckets I just mentioned, then the rate of pay is basically your full pay up to $511 a day, or $5,110 in aggregate. And the math behind that is basically you're paying 10 days of the established rate of $511 a day. So it's really to give employees 10 working days of that for those first 3 reasons. Now, the second tier, in which the employee would get 2/3 of their rate of pay up to $200 bucks a day, relate to the issue of care for others. You're caring for someone who has been under an isolation order. So it's not themselves, but some other one. Or they have a child that's in a school that's been placed or place of care is closed, which a lot of people are dealing with. If you think about daycares that have certain cap limits and maybe overfilled, maybe they had 30, or maybe 20 kids or something like that, and they only can have 10 now, and it's frozen as to which, the 10 that are not able to get daycare there are in your employment group. We have an issue there, particularly if there's an area where there's reduced childcare. So, and the last one, the employees experiencing any substantively, and this is kind of a catch-all, substantially similar condition specified by one of the HHS or Treasury or Labor. So again, 2 tiers of benefits, and that's how that works for that. Now, what DC did is under, again, if I go to our next slide here, under DC FMLA, DC, again, just for purposes of, for those who may not be aware, has a separate standard for FMLA leave. Under DC law, you have, if the person had 1 year of employment or 1,000 hours, they're covered under DC FMLA. And again, for DC, we're looking at 20 employees, not necessarily the higher standard of 75 employees in a certain area. So again, looking at the baseline between federal and DC, we start with that. Well, DC enacted its own statute after FFCRA passed. And under that statute, the declaration of emergency leave is applicable. So all employees are eligible. And the reason I brought up the 20 employees because under the DC Emergency Amendment Response Act, Response Emergency Amendment Act, the expansion gave it to all employees. So we don't have that waiting period that they accrue enough work hours, that type of thing. So they're entitled to DOE leave for any period that the mayor has declared a public emergency or they've been ordered to self-isolate or self-quarantine. Just a footnote to that, while Maryland and Virginia don't have specific regulations for this area, the recently enacted Maryland Healthy Working Families Act, which came into existence in February 2018, does give certain types of earned sick and paid leave for employers with 15 or more employees. So, in which they give 1 hour for every 30 hours of work, up to 40 hours. So, just keep that in mind for those of you who have operations that may expand within Maryland. So now DC actually, after this act passed, came back again and supplemented this act. So here on slide 17, we have what is the DC follow-up act to the Response Emergency Amendment Act, which then said that under the supplemental act, oops, sorry about that. Go back one. 1 second there. Which basically gave additional, 16, I'm sorry, I studied the wrong slide, which gave additional, thank you very much, gave additional rights for employees as long as they had been with the employer for 15 days. Now, under that particular legislation, we're now having a set amount of hours, which gives up to 80 hours of paid leave. So there's a difference, of course, as many of you know, between protected leave and protected paid leave. Whereas the initial statute was targeted at protected leave, this is actually giving a certain amount, or basically 2 weeks for full-time employees, of 2 weeks of protected paid leave if they're subject to a federal or a state quarantine order, that type of thing. And a lot of the same things we mentioned before about, are you experiencing symptoms? Are you caring for one who's experiencing symptoms? Does a child, child school, did a child care provider close because of this, or some other thing related to HHS or the Secretary of Treasury or Department of Labor. So those are the federal and DC, applicable leave laws. So when I talked about updating your leave policy, that's, where our target is that to make sure that at a baseline, and again, employers can always offer more, but we're saying that, that you're able to comply with those actual issues. So preparing the workforce, leave and accommodations. Existing leave policies, as I said, should be updated. The communication and return to work are going to be important. And one thing we're going to talk about, just going to a very pivotal issue, is the issue of telework. And we're going to talk specifically about, how do you determine that? Considerations about who can telework and who cannot, and how do you have, and if you haven't done it, I would strongly ask you to consider the drafting and preparation of a telework policy. And then the aspect of reasonable accommodations for those who actually are told or are requesting some type of accommodation because of some ailment they have. Anytime you're dealing with a health emergency, ADA issues are going to be prevalent, and how we manage the intake and capture of any relevant health information. So with that and considerations of relating to the work location, I'm going to go back to Danielle.
Thank you, Tyrone. So under OSHA, employers have a general duty to furnish a workplace free from hazards. So that's kind of the broad, keep your workplace safe and healthy for your employees. One note I will say about that is that you should hang the OSHA COVID-19 poster somewhere in your workplace. I'm sure that many, if not all of you, have some type of workplace safety OSHA poster already, but this poster is COVID-19 specific. At a high level, the OSHA guidance recommends things that we've touched on already, including implementing basic prevention infection measures, so hand washing, staying at home if you're sick, developing policies and procedures, communicating about workplace flexibilities, including telling sick employees to stay home, and then implementing workplace controls. One of those administrative controls is remote working. So what are the considerations when you're looking at your workforce for employees to return to work or work remotely? So phase 1 guidance in DC strongly recommends telework. So if you are in a business that has the capacity to support that, DC strongly recommends that you do so. Maryland and Virginia, they use different language. They encourage telework if possible. So that's just a note. It seems that telework in Maryland and Virginia is more encouraged rather than, strongly recommended. So you may have employees traveling around the DMV area by public transportation. And if you have employees who can work remotely to minimize the risks to themselves and others by avoiding public transportation, for example, is that something you can do? And that's something that DC guidance recommends that you look into. It should be an absolute consideration here. And the goal in mind, the goal here is to maximize the safety and minimize employee exposure to and interactions with others if you can. So with telework considerations, you'll want to look into the future and see what business looks like for you. So what does reporting to work look like in a year or 6 months or 2 years? And will you encourage certain roles to work from home? And when will you do that? Do you have roles that you can convert permanently to work from home schedules or on a coordinated schedule? So once you think about how to do this with the employees that you have, if it's possible, you should put in place a new work from home policy. And that policy should be really focused on defining the expectations, but also accounting for necessary flexibility. So one of the things that comes from working from home is, people have kids or, sick loved ones that they need to take care of. So your policy should touch on how to deal with folks who have some other considerations in their life that they need to also deal with. Other things you'll want to include in that policy is, what if there's some other viral disruption? What if we have, unfortunately, COVID come back in great numbers? You'll want to make sure that your policy accounts for that. Maybe it's that everyone teleworks in that case. You'll also want to account for your different employees that are exempt or non-exempt. So you'll want to make sure that you define the expectations for non-exempt employees, for example, and what they should be doing working from home. And I think, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but any type of remote wage and issue spotting that you can do would be good here and something to include in that policy. And if remote working incurs expenses for the employee, how will you handle a request for reimbursement, for example? Will you agree to reimburse any type of hardware, Wi-Fi access, a printer, paper, anything like that? Have that in your policy so that's something that you can refer back to if an employee does indeed request something like that. In DC, it's not required that you reimburse. However, other states do require that. That's state by state basis, and certainly something to look into if you do plan on including something like that in your policy. I'll talk a little bit now about something that we all know is going to happen, and that's physical changes to the workplace. So how is your workspace configured? It's probably going to be significantly changed. I know in our office, we have cubicles, for example, so any adjoining cubicles and desks is not something that is going to meet the health and safety guidelines across the board here. So you should be striving to keep employees at least 6 feet apart. That's something that we already know. But if that's not feasible, for example, you're, just a small space, consider installing a plexiglass or other physical dividers to minimize that close employee contact. Again, if you're in a retail space or a restaurant, keeping physical distance from the customers will also be important. So, just trying to maintain that social distance. Something that will be important here is to implement policies prohibiting employees from using each other's things, equipment in the workplace, to minimize interaction with high-risk touch points. So a few ideas there would be maybe removal of office amenities such as coffee machines. Unfortunately for everyone, that might be for the better. Maybe vending machines that you have are closed, maybe not allowing some common food spaces. If this is unavoidable, for example, many of us will use company printers or copiers, you should have a sanitizer or wipes next to that company equipment so that you can encourage employees to wipe down after use. And then have in your policies a plan for logistics relating to any of the PPE that you might need. Make sure that you have that before you return to work. And then what do you do if you run out? How are you going to get that quickly so that everyone has access to that PPE, hand sanitizer, soap, all of that. Some other ideas it'll come up here. Oh, there it is. Again, are creating one-way hallways maybe. I know that in CVS, for example, they've put down tape on the floors directing people to go a certain direction and only that way. That's something that you might want to take into your office space and consider as well, just to encourage employees to maintain that social distance. Other ideas are considering, you'll need to consider the nature of your business and how much in-person contact you have in your business. So is it necessary or is it customary? Do you have 3 in-person team meetings a week that you can cut down to 1 or none and you do it over a phone call, for example? Or is it absolutely necessary that you have that in-person meeting? A similar thing with client interaction. I know for those of you on the line who are restaurants, client interaction or retail is obviously essential. So you'll need to take some of the physical tips and rework them to keep with the frame of social distancing. And some other ideas here, of course, are limiting the number of people in meetings, conference rooms, elevators, putting up a sign saying no more than 2 or 3 people in an elevator might be helpful. And finally, are you able to clean and update your office ventilation system? This is something that's recommended in CDC guidance and also in DC guidance. So that's a consideration if something like that is available to you and you have the capacity to do that. You might want to include that on your list of considerations. And now I will turn it back to Tyrone.
Well, thank you very much, Danielle. I will say this, that one thing to keep in mind in this as we go about the aspects of what we're doing is, one, the culture of your workplace. We often have different cultures in different workplaces where we may have, and this could be a great thing for team camaraderie, but a lot of this is going to have people understand that the fist bumping and the high fives, that's something to be mindful of in the workforce. And the other thing is, are we applying everything in a kind of a systemic way? That one of the problems you often have as any employer when you have substantive changes to your work policies is, what exceptions are you making? Because one-off exceptions can run rampant. So I would ask that you really be careful as you're considering the policy changes that we're noting here about any exceptions, or which should be viewed very strictly with this, and how you're applying the Telework, because obviously if there's disparate impact or different, at least certainly some optics about disparate impact within certain protected classes with that can raise some questions. So I raised that. We go to health and safety. Again, we talked about social distancing, so I'm not going to belabor that too much. But the whole thing is this: I really need to have kind of a checkbox, so to speak. I'll mention this later, that some of the other states, such as New York, have literally requirements for safety plans that employers must have, and you almost have checklists about what you have to do, what you're going to do for. What are you doing as far as sanitizing? What are you doing as far as PPE? What are you doing as far as checking of temperature, or for employees who are showing some type of COVID-19 symptoms? Making sure that we're being across the board, consistent with how we're treating that. And in this instance, I think the fourth bullet in the slide is very important, because it almost becomes like, for a lot of employers, you have an employer policy handbook. It becomes an issue to make sure that your employees acknowledge that they have to abide by these rules. They announce that they're going to abide by these rules, and that you as an employer can implement discipline if they do not. So I'm sure we've all seen this, when you have people who have PPE with them, but they're not wearing it, or they have it hanging around their neck. No, you have to wear it. It's not just enough to bring it with you. You have to actually have it on, because if you just have it with you, that's not really doing anyone any good, and it's not what our policy requires. So creating the return to work plan, I alluded to what our friends up the Turnpike, up the I-95 in New York have done. DC doesn't have a formal template. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that you have your own separate kind of bullet point checklists on this, as far as what you want to create based off the areas we've discussed so far. And again, I do think having some type of employee acknowledgement is a wise thing to have, so that people will know that they've, it's not a question about, well, my employer didn't tell me X. No, you did. And we asked you to initial this and sign this. And now we have, your acknowledgement that you knew about the PPE rules. You knew about, that you had to inform us if you were symptomatic. You knew, about our rules on telework and all those types of things, so that it eliminates, kind of the at least reduces the likelihood of some type of issue as we go forward. Planning for staffing and scheduling. This is for practicality purposes. Consider how, you may have to assess the rollover in your staff, particularly how it may relate to social distancing. Do you have certain people come in different shifts now? Do you have a stagnation where, versus a 9 to 5 workday, it's really a 7 to 7 or 7 to 9 workday, and that allows you to have an early shift and a later shift. How are you rolling back in people who are furloughed? So now is a good time to get ahead of that, to think about how that can relate to your social distancing plans, and certainly relate to your operations with the communities or your customers, and how they're worked. Think about business considerations when you're saying that certain things cannot be done. Those are legitimate, but make sure we have that noted and documented, i.e. that we know 1 to 4 is the busy period of our day, and that's when we need all hands on deck. So how do we manage that? If an employee's saying I need to telework during that time, what are the things that if possible to kind of alleviate what the real concern is, the child care issue or something like that. And how are we phasing this in? How are we phasing this in as far as people coming in, and how are we phasing in the information? Planning for screening. This is a question we had a lot, I think, at the outset of this from employers about what can we do, temperature testing and things like that. At this point, I think hopefully a number of people know that employers are allowed to do temperature testing. I would encourage you to use obviously the electronic thermometers, not the ones certainly I grew up with many, many decades ago, for measuring thermal temperature on the body heat of employees. If you're going to do that, again, make sure that you're doing it systemically, that you're doing it, for all employees, that you're doing it a certain amount of time a day, that you're identifying it, i.e. we're not just doing it for our employees over the age of 65, we're doing it for all of our employees. And make sure that as we're using these supplies that, we have really concerned about privacy issues. How is it being maintained? Who has access to it? It should be very limited. Are we doing employees and visitors? And that deals for those of you who have significant public interaction. So we expect these areas to get additional regulatory guidance as we go forward. But one of the things we know is that there was a fairly recent issue. CDC has basically told us now that they do not recommend serological testing. That was a big issue, but that supplement to testing. Even though the EEOC has not had an official statement on this, I would advise, and certainly I think the better value of caution here is to avoid doing that. And then we will see again, above those things such as temperature testing, getting information on police that has them verify that they're not showing any or experiencing any COVID-19 related symptoms and things like that, so that we may want to have to put them in or ask them to go in quarantine. We don't have those issues come up. So with that, we're going to go to mitigation protocols and thinking about how to limit, harm here. Again, this goes to your risk management plan, so to speak, and I'm sure some of your business insurance providers will actually will be very interested in knowing that you have these type of mitigation protocols. But what is the exposure area? Who's experienced? What are your high intra-exit areas? And if you have an issue where there is a significant population, or certainly a number of people who've been exposed, making sure that you have a very quick action plan with respect to communicating that. And that's not saying that you're going to a place that, John has told us that he has tested positive COVID-19. Those more of a factor of an employee has told us that he has that he has COVID-19 related symptoms, and you may be exposed to that. So therefore, we're asking you to quarantine. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Danielle.
Thank you, Tyrone. So for our last topic, we should come up on the slide here momentarily. Wanted to talk about some potential employee claims that you might see as employers come about during this time. So there's a few different claims that could come around, including discrimination and harassment claims by employees, ADA reasonable accommodation claims, wage and hour, and unemployment compensation. So now is really a good time across the board to maybe have a refresher training or remind employees of your non-discrimination, harassment, those types of policies, and that you as an employer are an equal opportunity employer that doesn't permit these types of adverse actions. So I'll first discuss discrimination and harassment, which, as many of you probably know, can come out of federal law or the DC human rights law. How does this tie into the COVID-19 time? Well, as Tyrone had mentioned, it's important to treat all employees the same and not single out employees, particularly here because they're at a higher risk, or you believe for whatever reason that might be, maybe age, that they're at a higher risk of illness due to COVID-19. So the two examples there that I have that are maybe the more obvious ones are someone who's over the age of 65 or a pregnant woman. So if you single out Bob because he's over the age of 65 and he is the only person who's directed to telework, that might be an age-based action that is prohibited by law. Similar situation with someone who is pregnant. You may also run into a situation where an employee feels that they were treated differently based on a different protected class, such as race, national origin, due to concerns related to the transmission of COVID-19. So again, that's something where you would issue spot and make sure that all your employees are aware of your policies, and then just track any employee complaints or concerns, really engage with employees and take their concerns seriously. Of course, not permitting discrimination or harassment in the workplace. Similarly, you may see an increase in reasonable accommodation requests when employees return to work. So very broadly, a reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or the way that something is customarily done that enables your employee with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. And the idea is to remove the workplace barrier for those employees. Reasonable accommodations might look like a modification to the work environment, or it might be a physical barrier. So for a simple example, someone who needs to stand all day, but they have a disability where they easily fatigue, you can provide them a chair as a reasonable accommodation. During this time, you'll want to check in with employees who have known disabilities to you and make sure that any existing accommodations are working for them, or just check in and see if they need an adjustment. Also anticipate the possibility of increased disclosure to you of any mental health disorders that may or may not be disabilities under law, such as anxiety, OCD, PTSD, etc. Those individuals might have difficulty changing or adjusting to the disruptions and easing back into the transition. So you might see accommodation requests coming from those folks. You should, as the employer, engage in the interactive process in good faith to determine what accommodation might be effective for that employee. And what that is a back and forth collaborative discussion with the employee to really identify what the disability is. If you don't know what it is or it's not obvious, you are permitted to request medical documentation. And then, go back and forth and discuss with them what's helpful for them. They don't have to say the magic words of reasonable accommodation, but if you start to hear some of these different buzzwords, disability, I need help, anything like that, that kicks off your obligation as the employer to engage in that interactive process. And again, don't exclude an employee from the workplace because they have a medical condition that you think, for whatever reason, exposes them to severe illness due to COVID-19. So you can only take that action under the ADA if the disability poses a direct threat. And that's a very high standard. And I won't get into the nuances of that standard, but it is high. So ensure that you're engaging in the interactive process to see what can be done to assist this employee. And I'll turn it back to Tyrone to discuss wage and hour.
Yeah, and just really brief, because I know we're up on time. The issue for wage and hour is that there's certain things that employers are going to ask employees to do that prepare them for safety during COVID-19, such as wearing protective gear, taking off protective gear. Those things are going to be highly argued to be compensable activities, certainly for your hourly employees. So I would just ask you to take that into consideration as you have to actually make those considerations for safety. So with that in mind, also with unemployment insurance, DC and the federal government is very much interested in making sure that those employees who have been laid off or furloughed have access to benefits. So I would ask for those of us who are evaluating whether you're going to fight an unemployment claim based off of cause and determination to examine that very carefully, just because I think that there's going forward going to be a very strict or very a good amount of scrutiny about whether that exists. And there's been expansions to those protective benefits under DC law for unemployment benefits related to COVID. We've talked about this kind of like checkpoints to see the respective areas that we've covered today, so that for those of you who are creating plans, you can have a checklist for yourself. And I also want to just show you that we have on our Mintz firm website a coronavirus insight center that we would encourage anyone who wants to go and subscribe to, you have access to. With that, I definitely thank you for your time. Sorry, we ran a minute or two over here. To the extent there are questions for Danielle and I, we will touch base with Daryl so that we can capture any questions that have been submitted during the course of this program, and hopefully get back to make sure that any of those are covered. Thank you for your time, both of us, and I give it to you now, Daryl.
Hey, Tyrone and Danielle, I just wanted to say thank you again for this great information. I do have a couple questions I wanted to hit on, and hopefully our guests will indulge us for at least one or two or three quick questions. One of the things I wanted to find out, one of the questions that I got was, can an employer request a proof of a negative test for COVID, for example, is one of the questions that I got before a worker returns to work.
Well, the nuance of that question is whether just like any other health issue, what are the circumstances that made the employer think that the employee had this particular health situation? So let's just go through the usual checklist. Has the employee been symptomatic? Have they reported that? Did we ask them to go on quarantine? Did they get tested? If they went and got tested, and then they had, this goes under your assertions again in your policy that if an employee has signed off to say that if I am symptomatic, I have to do the quarantine. If I'm tested, I have to, and I get positive, I actually have to sit out for a required period. And then that goes to medical documentation upon return to work. So I would say make sure we go through that checklist first before we kind of, have someone just come into work and say, oh, you're sneezing, which by the way, is not necessarily related to COVID, and we're going to ask you to come back with a negative test result.
Great. And then I think you touched on this a little bit during the presentation, but one of the things that, or a couple people asked about this particular question is, what additional obligations does an employer accrue with respect to workers possibly working outside of both DC, but maybe potentially outside of the region, or are there any specific additional obligations that they may accrue?
Well, that's actually interesting, because if you look at the Maryland, for example, the New Maryland FMLA statute, it's based off where the employee provides services, not where the employer may be based. So that actually is a very key issue to those of you who have employees that may have been dispersed in different states. Whether that state statute actually says, as long as your employee is providing services predominantly in this state, then you now have to provide, for example, with Maryland, you are now governed by our standard for leave law. So I think particularly for DC-based employers who may have folks based in Maryland in particular, that's something to keep an eye on.
Right, and I will say we do have a lot of nonprofits that may be headquartered here in DC, but most certainly have or have bases of operations or a small satellite office in Maryland or Virginia. So that's a great point. Thank you for that. And I also wanted to ask, are there any particular suggestions for workplaces that are unionized, for example?
Oh, well, so now that we're going to go back to our collective bargaining agreements and how we the baseline is, you cannot legislate by a collective bargaining agreement a reduction in anything that's required under the federal laws, particularly for discrimination or for leave. Now, that said, to the extent there's certain pathways that have been, as far as, like, say, for example, with change of work logistics or change of work structure, and this, I think, would go a lot to scheduling issues and things like that. Let's go back to our CBA, because, to things that were terms and conditions of employment, where the employer has to make a temporary change to that. What are the rules for that, and how are we going to be governed by that? But I will say that the CBA is not going to be able to legislate us out of certainly a federal discrimination requirement or some federal safety requirement. We're not going to be able to do that by the CBA.
Okay, well, thank you. And I've got one last question I'm going to ask, and I think this is partly for a lot of our legal service provider friends who I think have joined us on the call, or maybe we'll listen to this at some other point. For those of us who are both trying to sort of figure out how to bring folks back to the workplace and our respective offices, but also provide service to clients outside of the workplace, potentially in spaces of partner organizations, usually where there are not typically the ability to social distance. Are there particular considerations for folks who are doing off-site sort of training? A lot of us have moved to doing everything virtual, but I wonder, as we move closer to trying to sort of deal with clients who need help out of the office, sort of what considerations might we need?
Is this respect to as legal service providers are practicing with issues in different states? I just want to make sure I understand the context.
Oh no, I'm just speaking more in terms of, we're in DC, but right, maybe we're working in a church. We were working in a library or a church basement, or just somewhere offsite. I get sort of already some of the stuff that's in the presentation, but I just wanted to sort of bring that up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the issues we've come up with, is how this relates to how all functionalities now change, including those of us, for example, in legal and HR for that matter. How are we maintaining documents? How are we maintaining financial records? I think for those of you who are offsite and have certain people who are designated for having access to check writing authority, right, for your organization, how are you making sure that different things that go into the privacy aspect of those, how are those being maintained? You know, for some people, actually, is very nervous about what happens in Zoom meetings, like, which is, you know, obviously going to be an issue. And to make sure that those things are certainly from a privacy aspect, where you have, well, you know, from the legal services point of view, and also HR, that certain sensitivities with documents and conversations are maintained, and doing that in such a way that, you know, we're not, the same things that we would have done if we were on site are still, you know, still being done as far as record keeping and all those things. And then having a follow up about how those things can be regimented in our files after we're, we're doing something virtually, or we're now meeting, as you just said, maybe in a very large public space. You know, I advise at several athletics programs, and one of the things that we're doing is, quite frankly, you know, things going to be done in a very big gymnasium when we're talking about certain sensitive issues and going through things with Title IX and all of that. But having some space where we can have that, and make sure there's containment there. So you're thinking about it in the right way, but also the follow up to make sure that we don't lose some of those kind of checks and balances, as far as making sure that we've taken care of the documentation, the access to information, the privacy issue, what things were flagged as far as privacy concerns, making sure we don't forget those issues.
Thank you so much for that. With that, I'm going to say thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks. You can feel free to virtually applaud Danielle and Tyrone, as I'm doing right now. We will be sending a survey to all of our participants, so feel free to share your thoughts there as well. I just want you all folks to remember, if you'd like to share this recording with your friends, you'll be able to find the slides and the audio at our resource site, www.lawhelp.org/DC/CED. During the registration for this webinar, a number of you expressed an interest in one-on-one consultations regarding reopening, as well as employment law more broadly. We will reach out directly to those via email, and if you didn't, but maybe realize you do have some questions, you will be able to make a note on that on your respective surveys. Again, I want to say thanks to Tyrone and Danielle and to Mintz for partnering with us. This is really great information. Have a great day, and be well and be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks.